Hello and thank you for joining me. So last week my dad would have turned 82. Now sadly he's no longer with us, but we do always try and ensure that we use these milestones like his birthday to keep his memory alive. Not so much for me, because obviously I think about him all the time, but more so for my children. I want to make sure that they remember Grandad. My dad was a huge personality. He was a schoolmaster and a headmaster, and he'd often be asked or invited to address chapel services and school services, often on remembrance services. On his birthday, therefore, I felt it appropriate, as I remember him, to share some of my dad's own words as he talked about his views on remembering those that we have lost. Now, just for context, Laura had been a student of my dad's when he'd worked in the East End of London in the 1960s. According to Dad, she'd been somewhat of a rebel, and they had gradually built up a close relationship. As she entered the sixth form, Laura very sadly developed cancer, and despite this, she insisted on completing her A-levels, in the end having to be carried by the boys to my dad's class to his lessons because his classroom was upstairs. And although she did indeed sit the exams, she did not hear the final results. Only my dad and her parents were ever told her grades. Laura's story was one that my dad returned to more than once in his chapel addresses, often on the anniversary of her death, and in 2015 he wrote the following. I certainly learnt a lot from Laura, because as a teacher I teach some of the time and I learn all of the time. I learnt that young people are essentially decent and fair-minded folk, and they don't want to be patronised by people like me, but treated equally and consistently. I can still see her very clearly now and hear her knocking on my door. 𝗙𝗲𝗏𝗊, I'm really angry with you. You're going easy on me in lessons and I don't want that. And I learnt that when someone leaves, for example school at the end of the year, or yes, even when they leave life, if we don't forget them, in a quite definite way they live on. I mean, I'm still talking about Laura 25 years later, and I'm introducing her to your memory for safekeeping. Dad took huge stock in remembering people. At his funeral, one of his ex-students came up to me and said that as his headmaster, my dad had attended the funeral of his grandfather, and although my dad had never met his grandfather and only met his grandmother at the funeral, for the next 20 years until she passed away, my dad had written to her every year on the anniversary of the passing of the boy's grandfather. He said it touched his grandmother so much to know that her husband was remembered. Now, whilst I knew my dad was a prolific writer, after his passing I discovered that he did this for many, many people. I hope listening to this, not only have I shared my dad's memory with you and Laura's memory with you, but I hope it has awakened the memory of others dear to you too, and in doing so enabled them to live on too. Thanks very much. Have a great weekend.